All right, welcome to your April Professional Development Talking Circle. As normal, we will get you officially disclaimed. This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. All right, now that you're officially disclaimed, then you must be here. Today, we're going to dive into talking about teacher licensing exam prep. We're going to give a few updates about next week's project director meeting and hopefully have some time for some program updates as well, and plug a few upcoming events outside the project director meeting. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Angela.
Thanks, Sarah. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Let's go ahead and jump to the next slide. So I'll just say briefly, I want to thank everybody for your excellent, just universally excellent annual performance reports. You know, I know that with Sarah and Sarah's help, we spent a lot of time preparing and providing guidance around the APRs, both in terms of the official webinar, but also with respect to our informal gatherings like this one. And I'll just say that they were very thorough. They helped us for sure in terms of being able to determine substantial progress. I know I had some follow-up calls with various folks throughout, and you guys have been very responsive. So I just want to thank you. As I read through those APRs, one of the issues that came up pretty much universally is what I call that universal challenge. And that's the issue of helping participants, teacher program candidates, to pass their state licensure exams. It's something that we know that not just you as our grantees, but certainly all teacher prep schools struggle with to some, to a lesser or greater degree. And when we start talking about distinct populations or demographics of teacher candidates, like Native students, like other students of color, or African-American or Latino students, we run into these issues around preparation. And I would say it's certainly exacerbated. And I don't think it's any different from what I observed and read in your respective APRs and the ways that you struggle with that. So as we move into that post-training phase for many of your candidates, well, not all of them, we know that there are delays and some are still in the actual training program. There are a number that either have been or about to be out and are in that phase of their journey of trying to pass the exam. We talked about it from a grants management perspective already, just in terms of ways that you could use your funds to beef up the kind of support and strategies. But today I really want to hear from you guys and just spend a little bit of time learning and sharing amongst all of you the challenges and the opportunities that you face in supporting successful licensure among your candidates. Next slide, please. So within the resources that Sarah and the OIE TA team shared earlier this week with you via email, you probably saw, if you had a chance to look at any of them, you saw this graph. And this graph does a good job of just kind of popping out, I think, some really interesting information. So I want to turn it over, and actually, guys, if we can just go to a screen with that doesn't have the presentation online for a second, but I am curious, given that chart and given where you saw the elementary teacher pass rates down at 46%. I'm curious to know from all of you, is that surprising to you? I'm just out of curiosity, is that surprising? Did you expect to see that compared to the pass rates of other professions? And feel free to just unmute and speak out.
when you look at that data, I'm guessing that that data is broadly across the United States. It's not data that's disaggregated per population or preparation, you know, because I think if we looked at the, if we disaggregated that data and looked at community college prep participants or anything like that, I think it would be even more concerning. I think, you know, our biggest challenge is to be able to get them past that first praxis, which are like the math, particularly the math and perhaps writing. Once they're in the teacher ed preparation program and they're learning the skills for actually bringing teaching skills into the classroom for their students, they seem to do quite well. But the barrier is that initial praxis one, at least in my, and so, you know, trying to find out what can we do, because I still have a couple that are in that bucket. And I know that they would be fabulous teachers if I could just get them over the hump. I think, like I said, if we looked at that data disaggregated across populations, we'd find it to be even more concerning.
Thanks, Carmelita. And we're going to get into the more micro of this conversation in a minute, but still thinking globally and compared to, again, the pass rates of the other professions, you know, doctor, psychologist or psychiatrist, rather nursing, et cetera. You saw much higher first-time pass rates. And what do you think that tells us about this in comparison to other licensed professionals? Anything in particular, or what does it not tell us?
Hi, Angela and everyone. You know, I guess it's not surprising to me. So even though we've had Praxis exams or other licensure exams in place since the early 2000s in South Dakota, it's still fairly new in the field of education. And you know, I don't know that other licensure exams, if we go back to the 60s when the teacher licensure exams first came in, I really don't believe there were other licensure exams which were purposely developed to prevent a group of individuals from entering the field like there was with the teacher licensure exams and the work with ETS. There is, you know, I guess I know that a lot of work has been done to ensure fairness in testing since that time. But our candidates tend not to be good test takers, you know, and really what I find is candidates who are good test takers come in and take their exams without problems. But the vast majority of our candidates struggle with how they look at testing, how they approach testing, how they prepare for testing. And we really have had to do a lot with mindset change to get them on the right, kind of on the right path, I guess. But it doesn't surprise me, not with what I've seen.
I appreciate that, Shannon. Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Dilly.
No,
go ahead, Valerie. I'll go second.
Well, I was going to say this really speaks to on a more of a global problem that we're facing is systemic inequity in education. So when you got inner school city kids and or indigenous populations, they do not have that same access to educational material or the expertise that a lot of the other students have. So there are so many systems that is working against them, and yet we're putting them on the forefront with everybody else, and that in itself is unfair and is inequitable. So it's a matter of how can we, it's beyond mindset. I mean, we know we have to take that, that's great, you walk in, but what are you walking in with? How much tools, how many tools are in your backpack? And they don't. And so it's a matter of addressing that and starting in at grassroots. I know it sounds like a lot, but this is something that we must do to encourage and to actually support going beyond the spoken word. So that's where we're giving in-house Praxis training and all of that. It's hard, but it's something that we're all working together. It has to be, it takes a village in many ways of thinking. So that's my 2 cents here this morning. Yeah, thank you.
Valerie?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this conversation that's happening here. I just wanted to add that I think the test varies across each state. Some states have EdTPA, which is pretty rigorous process. And some states like Arizona, we don't have EdTPA, and our students, they've been successful with graduating and getting certified and completing those tests. But we've also have a process in place that is within our entire, within our college, where there's some support that's offered to them as well. Also through our grant funds as well too. So we provide them with the test prep materials, but and I don't know if that data, that the graph that you shared kind of speaks to the difference in the tests. And I think because it varies across the states, Arizona has, I think we're the lowest, we're either the lowest or the second to the lowest in terms of the teacher salary. And so recruiting teachers is a very difficult process in our state. And so I think it also ties to just, what all of the different conversations that are happening at the state level.
Thank you, Valerie. So I hear you talking about incentivizing, right? The motivation, number one, for your students. All of you kind of put, I think, a different lens on the same issue of inequity, right? You're all speaking to different elements that, different inequities that perpetuate these challenges. And I was struck, Renuka, as you were talking, one parallel I thought about in terms of, these, I'm going to use the word accommodations, which might seem pejorative, but the kind of supports, the accommodations, the extra mile, if you will, that you should give to historically underserved populations, to include Native American students. But it struck me because I thought about a parallel. I was recently on a call with a number of undergraduate colleges. This was for my daughter, just looking at different college admissions processes. And it was an interesting conversation because it was everybody from Harvard to Harvey Mudd to University of Arizona. It was everybody. So it was all tiers of schools and universities, private and public. But I kept hearing all of the ways that they were looking to pivot and really rethink admissions for undergraduates given the pandemic. And it really struck me about the similarity or the parallel to, well, when you're serving historically underserved populations, you should do that too. You should be pivoting, right? And rethinking the approach and the outlook and what it means in terms of supports to make it, if you will, that level playing field. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but this is a great start to the conversation. Anybody else before I move to the next slide?
Angela, can I throw in my 2 cents?
Yeah.
I'm DeLacy Gamley and I'm from California. I'm at Claremont Graduate University. So in California, we are like the state that seems to love assessments. I mean, there are so many teacher assessments that our candidates have to go through at the beginning, in the middle. We use the CSET exam, the basic educational skills exam, the TPA, the RECA for reading. So there are a lot of exams. And at times I can get frustrated because so many of the exams don't look at our candidates holistically, and they don't seem to always draw out the things that we really value in our abilities of our candidates to connect to their students, to really reach the heart of their students, to connect with their parents, and that there aren't really those measurements. But at the same time, we try to take the approach and remember the research shows us that good teachers know their content. And so if a candidate is having trouble passing the test, it might be because they actually, I mean, there are factors that everybody's mentioned, like they don't seem to take standardized assessments well, et cetera. But there also might be a hole in their own preparation. And so how do we take that and really go back and sort of, okay, like, let's look at this. What do you feel you know well? What don't you know well? And really use it as an opportunity to make sure that our teachers are going into the classroom with as much content and pedagogical knowledge as they need in order to break these cycles. Because we want to make sure, so we try to turn it into an empowering reinforcement, while at the same time recognizing that the tests are not recognizing the holistic whole teacher that should be valued.
Thanks, DeLacy. Let's go, your comments lead into something we're going to get to about 3 slides from now, but hold that thought because we're going to come back to that issue. Sarah, can we get to the next slide? So that's the one we were talking about. Now we're on to test prep. And again, you guys have talked about some of these, certainly in your own performance reporting, but in general, you're familiar with all of these, you know, the test prep course or clinic, integrating some of the material from the test into your coursework, the tutoring, the independent study, and then they share these resources that I'm referring to, and we'll come back to them at the end. The most common types of test prep tools: Plato, ETS Test at a Glance, ETS Test Guides, Retire Test, and then Learning Plus system. And I'm just curious, and we don't need to all go around, but just anybody in particular see any of these to be particularly more effective than the others for the purposes of your own candidates? Any thoughts? DeLacy, thank you. You wrote teacherstestprep.com is something that you utilize sometimes. And
Yeah.
please feel free to put those in the chat too, guys, if you don't want to speak out. Okay.
Can I just say something that I was able to broker with them, because they have a free platform that everybody can use. And then if the platform shows that somebody needs additional preparation, they can then pay for additional support. But this is what we did. If you are in partnership with the organization, so testprep.com, and the name of the student and the payment comes from your organization, it's at a 50% discount. So for example, we use it in instances, not even when it's our Native American students, but our other students, somebody will come and say, I need to use this. They give us a check for $100 and we sign another check off to Test Prep, but it gets our students a 50% discount. So we don't make any money on the exchange, but it allows us to get our students the support. So know that if you're interested in them, that there's a way that you can kind of work the jerry-rig the system for a discount for your students.
Thanks, DeLacy. Those tips are always good. So I welcome those from others as well. Thank you. And I know that, and feel free, keep adding to the chat, guys. And let's go to the next slide, Sarah. So the Praxis test, which we were all just talking about right now, here's some just observations from some of the reports that we shared with you earlier this week. And these are just a few highlights that Sarah pulled out. And that's one is that, of course, teacher candidates who successfully pass the Praxis 1 test, kind of to your point, Carmelita, on the first try, have a much better chance of passing subsequent, right? The content tests. On the Praxis writing test, multiple choice is more of a struggle than the essay. on the Praxis 2 tests. And this, of course, is global, right? We're not disaggregating for the populations that you're serving necessarily. The Praxis 2 tests, the essays are more of a struggle than multiple choice. And, linked to the case study portion of the test and covers students as learners, instruction and assessment, communication techniques, teacher professionalism, right? So this is what we're finding. Freshman and sophomore students tend to score higher on the Praxis 1. And who knows, I can't read into that or draw any correlations from that, but I think it's an interesting observation. And then the GPA tends to correlate with Praxis 1 scores. So that's another interesting, I think, observation. I don't know if you guys are finding the same thing, but anybody have any comments or critiques of those observations?
Well, and Angela, I'll just throw in one thing from the report because this was just the highlight reel. But you were talking about that freshman and sophomore student piece.
Yeah.
And the discussion that they had in the particular report that's from was the thought that potentially, and this was pulled from interviews from educators, was that the content needed for that Praxis 1 was fresher in their mind. Since they were closer to being in high school, they'd just taken math classes and they'd just been practicing some of that. By the time they were seniors or postgraduate students, they didn't remember algebra. They didn't remember geometry. Some of those scientific concepts, some of those things that were fresher when they were freshmen had faded a bit.
As someone with an 11-year math course gap, I can respect that challenge.
Oh, yeah. I had that with my own tests. I only had to study the math part. I knew I was okay on the rest, but I didn't remember any math from high school and had to study it for the test.
Thank you, DeLacy. And so you're seeing that correlation with the other standardized tests as well, and scoring higher. I don't think that's surprising. I think you guys probably see a parallel as well with some of your students. Let's go to the next slide. So while these resources, these reports that came out from places like the National Center on Teacher Quality, ETS, et cetera, they talk about many issues, but we focused here in this slide on those findings that are specific to teacher prep programs and sort of where they play a role. So one, they identified what they call deficiencies in K12 Ed and Prep. And so DeLacy, you were speaking to this earlier, of just what are the gaps, right? So seeing that required course content is not aligned with what is required on licensing tests or in the classroom instructional setting. So, the benefit and sometimes the challenge of having flexibility in that course sequencing is too much freedom is pulling you away from really helping them best prepare for those general requirements. And then there's the challenge to motivate students to participate sometimes in test prep activities. And that's just a reality that I know all of you live with. And then education faculty at times, depending again, also on distance, right? Distance from the classroom over time and whatnot, and with real life experience of just being not all familiar with the licensure tests and really how it relates to what they're going to have to know and be able to do in a real classroom. And then the lack of collaboration between the ed program faculty, those silos that I think in all our respective fields we can relate to, being stuck in that place and the lack of partnering and supporting one another across content areas. And here they call out arts and science in particular. And then finally, just that the test content does not align with candidates' educational experiences. And that comes back to the appropriateness and the bias of the tests themselves, right? And the limitations. And, inevitably the individual candidate being responsible for closing that gap through just practice and preparation versus any, systemic change necessarily. We talked about, well, the licensing requirements do vary a lot across states. I don't think still you see much in the way of a differentiation really for, across the sub-racial and ethnic demographic groups in terms of performance. You do see some lights there of success across the country, but I think there's still a lot of shared challenges across the states. Let's go to the next slide. So we're going to take a moment. This is the first of a couple of polls, but again, in the reports that we shared, they highlighted a whole series of different, challenges, right? And so I'm going to ask each of you to just read through those challenges and pick as many or as few that resonate for you in terms of what you're finding with your training participants right now.
It should be popping up on everyone's screen. If you happen to be joining from a mobile device, just take your finger and swipe over, and that should help you find the poll. And then last option, if neither one works out, just pop it in the chat box.
Angela, there's one variable that I didn't see listed that I see play out. And that is, well, maybe it could be captured under motivation, but I have students that are fearful of the test, that I just need to really just work with them to get comfortable with the idea. You're gonna, I think you know this. I think you're gonna pass it. Let's register.
Yep.
And just a lot of just personal anxiety about that process.
I think you could tie it to a number of things there, DeLacy. I mean, I could argue you could tie it to the deficiency in K12 ed education and prep, right?
I did check that. Yes.
Yeah, the orientation that people have to tests and exams. So I think that's a fair issue. So if you guys look across, I see the struggling with essay questions.
Mm-hmm.
What we just spoke to, deficiencies in K12 education and prep, and students struggling with multiple choice questions. And again, this is really more for you guys to see where you have some common challenges, and really I'm hoping that we can get today, at least for a couple minutes, what you guys are trying to do to address those very challenges. And Sarah, we have one that's the bright orange. I'm guessing that's because it's the has the greatest degree of consensus there.
Yes, that is our top answer with students struggling with essay questions.
Sorry, Siri's trying to talk. Okay.
My name does inspire Siri to get involved.
All right, enunciation. I will remember that in the future. Thank you. Okay, so just everybody taking a look, everybody got a chance to see sort of where you all sort of find yourselves collectively versus individually. Thank you. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So again, in some of the reports, in one of the reports we shared, and they have this very crazy graphic, which shared that out of 817 undergraduate programs, only 21 reasonably aligned content coverage with most, not even all, but most elementary content topics. And I thought that was fascinating. And this speaks a lot to, there's preparation and there's preparation for the right thing, right? So being far more targeted and strategic and knowing what you're preparing your candidates for.
And I know it's a little hard to see because of the amount of content and depending on your screen size, but we'll send out the slide deck as well.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Anybody surprised by this? Does it seem kind of?
It's disappointing, but not surprising.
Yeah. So let's go to the next slide, Sarah.
Oh, you wanted to jump way ahead.
So these I'm just going to throw out. And again, this is really more just a conversation amongst ourselves here. So 3 questions I threw out here, and I'll take any responses to any of these. Is 1, what tests or content areas are most challenging for your training participants? What is one strategy your institution has used to address this? And then the last question is really time sensitive, is how did this recent shift a la pandemic to remote learning help or hinder this work? Your supports and what you're trying to do to help people be successful. And I know, I'm going to hold to the side the fact that, for example, some of the license exams weren't even available. There was that. But even so, the preparation doesn't end. So what is that, what was that looking like? Was that better? Was it worse? Did you not really see a change? Or was it just more difficult to tell as a result of going remote? So I'll leave that open and let folks speak.
Somebody's at the door.
Any thoughts?
Nobody's jumping in, so I will.
Thank you, Shannon.
So I guess a comment that actually goes back a couple of slides with freshmen and sophomores performing better on the Praxis 1 tests. We actually use the Praxis 2 exam, the elementary content, as acceptance into our teacher prep program. For all those same reasons that were talked about, is by using the elementary content test, we're getting not just the math and the language arts, but we're also picking up science and social studies when it's closest to the time that they've completed their general education course requirements. So that has been a strategy that's been helpful for us. It's also a cost saver for candidates. In relation to the current slides, in their content area, for us, it's been all over the board. Candidates tend to score well in their area of interest. If they're interested in a particular topic, they tend to score well. But one of the areas we've probably seen the greatest improvement on has been in the constructed response items on the Principles of Learning and Teaching exam. And what we found with our candidates is they tended to address the topics like they do when they speak, which is often tell the whole story before getting to the point. And that doesn't work to finish the test in time, nor does it help them to meet the full criteria to get all they can out of the scoring rubrics. So we've started unpacking the rubrics with them, but we've also introduced them to a writing strategy. And I liken it to be similar to, the 5 to 7 sentence paragraph model, in which we break down what the rubric calls for, and then we identify that in, here's what goes in your first sentence, here's what goes in your second sentence, here's what goes in the next. So they're, examining what is it asking. Let's pinpoint it, and helping them to realize there is extraneous information in those scenarios. They can't address it all. They only need to answer the question. So identify the question, restate it, find their supporting evidence, bring in their research methodology, provide an example, and then come back and restate it. And so we call it, we have an acronym that goes through all those steps. We call it the prepare model. And we have found that has significantly changed student performance on the exams. The other strategy we have found is, we know that if we can get students to take their exams within 2 weeks after they've completed a thorough review, whether it's been as part of our boot camp or a study on their own, if we can get them to take it within that 2-week window when they finish studying, that they are twice as likely to pass their exam if they, if they had scheduled it out at a later time. So two things we've done.
That's great, Shannon. Thank you. And all of that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that certainly makes sense in terms of proximity, back to proximity of acquisition, right, of knowledge to application in the test taking. Any other folks want to share?
Yeah, I would like to jump in here. So first of all, I don't like standardized testing because at any given time, it only shows a snapshot of what a person may or may not do, but that depends on that day, circumstances, whatever. But reality is that the tests are here, at least for the time being. And what do we do about it? So one of the things, the essays have been a struggle for our students. However, so the ways I had to think about is, okay, let's take a familiar story. What is a story? Tell me a story that you have. Why is that important? So going backwards and building that thesis sentence, what are you talking about? And how do we position this within the body of the essay? How do we introduce? So what becomes the topic sentence, and how do we follow through? So we had to do a lot of realigning of how we think about a subject, okay? So the other thing is making whatever the topic is relatable. How do we relate to that? See, the problem with these tests is that they're not indigenous pedagogy driven. So unless you are coming from that mainstream educational stream, it is a difficult step, not impossible, but it just needs a little bit of, maybe a lot of retraining of how we think about the subject. So my thing is, I've been using film clips. I've been talking about things and just putting it side by side to think, hey, how do we, so now it's making sense. Now actually they're graduating, but the thing is, these are the ways that I propose to go forward, just bringing those unconventional ways of utilizing these methods to understand, and so that they can be successful, because in the end, that's what matters, student success. How do we get there? How do we engage the students so it's not all doom and gloom, So it's just a bit of an unconventional, somebody might say, hey, time consuming, but what's my purpose? What's my role? My role is to support their learning. So if that's what it takes, then that's how we do it. So we always had Praxis prep every week, couple of hours. So that has helped. And that's a time that everybody can come together, and we put stuff on the board and we learn and we dissect and we try to understand. And for many of our students, it's been a struggle, and I understand. Listen, I had to take the GRE, and I know it's not all pleasant, but these are things we have to do. So yeah, that's
Shannon, I appreciate your comment here on the chat box as well, of talking about where people actually take the test, and the idea of, just as important as it is to be prepared, it's also very important about what that environment is, right? That you're taking the test in. To your point, Renuka, right? Of that's a snapshot, but so where you are matters, right? When you take the test. I appreciate that comment there, Shannon. I can imagine that some are going to be preferential over others. So you talk about the campus-based versus community center, and that makes a whole lot of sense in terms of the chaos that people might feel going around them in certain settings versus others.
Actually, with that, can I also add, Shannon, you're absolutely right. Because you know what? People respond to other people. When you're in a room with many others in sort of like the same room, doing the same thing kind of thing, there's a sense of empathy, there's a sense of collective empathy and taking care, and that does not happen in an online environment. You're on your own, and you get very anxious because they have to, apparently they cover the area, they see things. And one of my students was told that his tribal ID was not acceptable and he had to cancel it. So I mean, there was a huge to do with our department. We wrote, and then he was readmitted. Like, it was crazy. I mean, this was for the second Praxis, the content piece. So, there are these things, because I think the people who are overseeing sometimes aren't up to par with what is and what is not. So those are some of the things that we need to iron out as well. Thank you.
So
Sorry.
institutional barriers to being able to, again, just simply be there to take the test in this case. I think somebody else, who was it? I think Valerie, the number of years that teacher candidates have been in paraprofessional positions. So again, I know you guys talked about this, sort of that distance, right, between the time you've really last been in a classroom, right? Last been in that kind of environment for learning and test taking. And the challenge that comes along with that. One of the strategies I know that NCTQ had talked about was early and often. So, and I know I've mentioned this just in terms of when we were talking about what can you do with some of those carryover funds and supporting or beefing up, right, the supports around test taking. So, that to include things like, let them take the tests over and over again, and back to that until they're not afraid of it anymore, until they're not concerned, to your point, Valerie, about the time sensitivity, right? The challenges of feeling like you're under the gun, the pressure, and just how we're so oriented and conditioned to, big stake, high stakes tests in general. And you would think for all the testing we do of our K12 students that they would be used to it by now. That hasn't happened yet. Anything else, guys? And that was Nancy, I'm sorry, not Valerie, that talked about the timing, the time crunch of test taking.
As hard as K-12 testing and all of that, this is at a different level that is really quite scary for them, because this is their life now. K-12, you still have some support. Yes, you got this streaming and all that. That's another thing that I don't like. But anyways, but when it comes to this, they have chosen this pathway and this is what they want to do. Imagine, it's like somebody telling me I didn't make it in this, so I couldn't do my PhD, for example. It would have devastated me. You know what I mean? But so we got to sometimes step back and put ourselves in that situation and say, so this is what they're beginning to begin their life, and to be told that you didn't make it because the points. I had a student 1 point less, they wouldn't consider. See, this is what we're systemic inequity is something that we are looking at UND anyways.
So I think in general, my challenge to you all is to be thinking about, ways to evidence that inequity, right? So what is the data, right? What is the data that you can collect? What are those indicators that help to underscore the inequities as a result of, again, back to institutional barriers or, test prep barriers, the funding, the subsidies to support students in preparation, and, the difference, the real difference in cost between supporting, let's say, a paraprofessional who's been out of the classroom for 12 years versus, somebody coming straight out of undergrad. That's a huge differential. And so capturing the cost differential and the preparation, thinking about what are the ways that you can really paint a picture of what it takes to create, again, what we'll call that level playing field, right? Getting everybody to a level of preparation where they feel confident and ready to take the exam. and hopefully pass it. So I think those are just things I would challenge you to consider moving down the line. And that's the long term, right? That's the long-term conversation about coming into, systems change, right? And you have to do that with that incremental focus, that laser focus on consistent and, valid and reliable data collection to help drive those conversations and maybe help us identify, gaps or issues that we've kind of breezed past, so I think that's important as we move forward. And I share that thinking about particularly that person who's been out of the classroom for a long time, just from the standpoint of this program, which, congressional intent, we emphasize, right? We encourage people to be looking at non-traditional students. So as part of this program, we encourage you to look at people who don't go that normal pathway of straight out of undergrad. So that's something to be thinking about, is what are ways that we're doing that, but what does that mean for the cost? So I'm just going to ask one last question as we wrap this up. And in the meantime, if you can go to the next slide, Sarah, to start sharing out the resources, just kind of the screenshots. I really love to hear from you guys in the chat box. We'll relegate it to the chat box today, or if you want to send me something later that maybe gives me, what is that, what do you think ballpark estimate is the cost that you spend on somebody who is coming right out of undergrad versus somebody who has been out of the classroom for a while and you're helping them transition, right, from maybe a support staff to that teacher role? And what does that mean for what you need to make them successful, or at least support their pathway there? So again, Sarah sent these earlier this week. So that would have been from the OIE TA team email address. A Fair Chance, which is National Center Council on Teacher Quality. I'm sorry, not Center. And in fact, they came out with something even more recently as well, about diversity and a highly effective workforce. So, I mean, I think this is something that's not going to go away. I would further argue that when you look, for example, we can go to the next slide, at the most recent rescue plan from the White House, you see, I mean, I don't know if people really understand the magnitude of funding available right now at the K12 level. And much of it can go toward our Title II teacher prep. Much of it can go to anything Title I, of course, which means, serving underserved populations, low income communities, and really thinking about what are ways that you might be thinking or need to start thinking about partnering with those K12 people to make sure that they see a pipeline going in two directions. So, there's a lot of, I know there's been a lot of work in very recent years around Grow Your Own. I've heard quite a bit more happening around that in ways to subsidize that kind of pathway, that trajectory. So there's a lot of stuff I think people are trying to kind of think about that. And I think that's another place I would challenge you to be thinking about, what are ways that you can be partnering with those LEAs beyond just looking to place your candidates, but to find your candidates, right? So what are those conversations that need to start happening? And then within your own institutions, that earlier issue identified about the siloing, right? So to greater or lesser extents, how can you develop those partnerships across your institutions, which do have plenty of, wonderful people and resources that can be shared in support of this. And I'm sure you can find mutual benefit in supporting candidates' preparation. ETS has toward increasing teacher diversity, targeting support and intervention for teacher licensure candidates. And let's go to the last one. And then teacher preparation analytics. So building an evidence-based system for teacher prep. So this was done with Pearson and others. And again, I would just encourage you to just scan, take a look if you haven't already or aren't familiar with these. They're great resources, and I'm sure we'll be sending more in the coming days and weeks ahead as we continue with these conversations. But I hope these are of some help to you in kind of thinking about new ways to support your students. Next slide. So again, just to recap, there's the front end, right, which is the screening of candidates. I have to say, I think many of you do quite a good job. And, outside of having a crystal ball to know, I think you guys work really hard at making sure that, the candidates you identify are the right fit. Encouraging that Praxis 1 testing as soon as students express interest in that teaching path. It hits it at the issues in so many ways. Earlier testing. So again, provides more time for you to know what the issues are for your candidates, as well as getting them familiar. It's less scary. You're demystifying this process, right? This preparation. And then be transparent about the passing rates at your institution. And that does a couple of things. Maybe, certainly it might prompt scrutiny, but it also might prompt resources that you might not otherwise have gotten from your institutions. So I think not being afraid of that data is really important. Anything else, Sarah, you want to add to this based on what you've heard today?
I think that covers that one, but we do have one more of a few
Right.
additional.
Let's go to that next slide. So asking your faculty to take the tests, teaching what they know and can now say they've experienced. We talked about this, promoting that faculty collaboration, I would say both within and across your departments or programs. Requiring a test prep course as part of a degree plan. And that's another thing I'll come back to just from the perspective of this program. To the extent you have any kind of requirements like this, those are the things that can become part of those training costs, right? For service payback purposes. Require a past practice test prior to taking the real test. So, I think there's a lot there that you can build in terms of a quote unquote requirement that really is about helping them, not so much about creating some other, obstacle to their graduation. And then the testing anxiety, I think, again, that demystification, getting them familiar early and often, helping them understand and to learn to see it as something to be tackled and not something to be feared. And that's an ongoing process. That's not overnight, I understand. And you guys thank you for sharing the comments you're sharing on the chat box as well. Next slide, please. So we've talked about, I just walked through some of those strategies. I'd be interested to know what if any of those your project does now. So just taking a quick scan at those guys.
And while you're starting to fast finger in your next poll, I was going to share in regards to the last two strategies. In my experience, I've been in states where they require a past practice test prior to being able to take the real test. And to some extent, it's actually helped with that test anxiety because the student knew going into the real test, well, I took a test that was a real test, but was the practice, and I aced it. I did great. I had no problem passing it. So I shouldn't be quite as anxious about this actual test because I know I can do it. I've already done it. And we set up the practice test actually very similar to kind of the environment they would be forced to take their real test in to help with some of that as well.
Thank you, Sarah. one last thing I'll say, because I saw very few or not as many of you have requirements, right, in this area around test taking. One thing to consider while making it a requirement, if you will, quote unquote, for your specific, your broader education program might be a longer term effort to employ, to institute. That could be something I'll just throw out there for as part of the PD program, meaning the candidates who receive the support from this grant. You could certainly establish that as a policy, as one of the things above and beyond. So there are ways to get at that, right? Depending on what kind of supports you might be providing to your students, whether this funding source or another funding source. So just something to think about as, kind of a proxy for that. Thank you guys. So this is great. This is great. I'm going to move us along, Sarah. I talked about really the questions on the induction services discussion slide, the next slide. So let's move on. And I don't know if you want to give us the spiel on advertising. And let me just wrap up right before you do and just say thank you guys for kind of just touching base on this today. This is not a deep discussion, but I'd really love to know, kind of from what we discussed today, if there are things as we go into this next year where really the focus of the TA will be more on the induction services side and on teacher test prep, et cetera. What are the things that you'd like to see from us over the next, 9 to 12 months in terms of, things that can help your students get to that final goal? So I look forward to hearing from you either now or later. Okay. Sarah, turn it over to you.
So just a couple of quick reminders. I'm sure all of you are aware that the project director meeting is next week. You should have received an email from me earlier this week that we do have a few additional seats. Some of you had reached out and said, I know I'm only allowed 3 people, but I have this other person. Well, it's time for that other person. So we do have some extra spots. I'm going to put the registration link in the chat box so that if you do have any additional team members that you'd like to include, you're welcome to get them registered. It's just first come, first serve for those additional seats. The other thing I want to remind you about in regards to this is I beg of you to try logging in prior to the exact moment that Julian starts our first keynote. So it's not a super difficult system to utilize. We try to make it as user-friendly as possible, but the first time you log in, you do have to set a password. And so it really, really helps if you'll just try out logging in once before. You should have gotten an email. It would have said that it was from the OIE project directors meeting. It's an automated email though, so it does come from the Pathable platform that we're holding the meeting on. So if you haven't seen that email, it probably went to your junk folder or your spam folder. So take a look. If you can't find the email, just reach out to us and we can get you a new one. But you'll actually click the link in that email to log in the first time. Okay. And if you tried to register, but your institution was not an option, we have fixed that. So there were a couple of you who were in the earlier cohorts whose institutions were not showing up in the dropdown. That should be fixed now. If it is not, let me know, but I double checked, so I'm pretty sure everybody's completely in now. And I do have one more, well, this is actually my next to last poll here. So I have a quick poll in regards to Twitter and social media while I just quickly chat through. So the poll is really asking if you have a Twitter, whether personal or professional or not, and then what other social media platforms you use with your organization. So if you don't mind popping that in, we're going to have something at the project director meeting called a social wall. And it's basically a way for all of you to be able to share about your programs, great things going on, share ideas, or even just share things that you've learned through the project director meeting. But it is powered by Twitter. And so the department, Office of Indian Ed, actually just got a Twitter. It is brand new. You could be one of the first people to see it. It's only been up about a week. If you are a Twitter person, you can find it at OIE Indian Ed. That's their handle. And for this event, if you have a Twitter or would like a Twitter, I've also got a link that can kind of walk you through how to set one up if that's something you'd like to do. It is definitely not required, but something you're welcome to partake in. You can post those pictures, those videos, or just those comments and just hashtag them, hashtag OIE 2021. Anything you post with that hashtag is going to magically appear on the social wall. So you'll see that once you log into the system. We already have a few things populated there so you can get the idea. But just know we'd love for you to be able to post about your programs there. One caveat though, do please make sure to follow your organization's social media policy. We don't want to get anyone into hot water, so make sure that you're allowed to use Twitter, you're allowed to share the photos or things that you're sharing. All right, and it looks like most people have fast fingered in their poll. And I will say, y'all are probably my biggest group of Twitter users thus far out of my Talking Circle groups. So there you go. We'll have lots of great PD program information on the social wall. And then just to wrap up, we're going to cover some of this in the upcoming in the interest of time. And so we will just move forward. We do have a few upcoming events. We are continuing our distance learning series. I know many of you tune into that. So we'll be back right after the project director meeting with virtual field trips. Alani has prepared some great information for you. And then in May, we'll be there with games and more and some tips for student engagement and tools. And we'll wrap up June 1st with our virtual share fair. If you or any of your team have been doing cool things with virtual learning, please reach out. We would like to feature you in our virtual share fair on the 1st. And then the last two events, one is April office hours. That's on April 29th. That's our casual come and go event for any questions you may have. That's from 1 to 2 on the 29th. And then the PD program Talking Circle that was originally scheduled for May 21st. It's going to be a little problematic with the new competition timeline. So we are going to go ahead and cancel the May program Talking Circle. We'll see you again in June, don't worry. And I'll send a reminder since we have a month off, just to make sure everyone remembers to come back, and we will have conversation, discussion, and networking again in June. So
Awesome.
with that, if anybody has any final questions, we're happy to answer them, but making sure you do have our contact information as well. Like I said, if you have any trouble finding that email, you can reach out to us at that oie@seiservices.com. And I know Sarah has posted our end of event survey over in the chat box. We would love if you would take 2 to 3 minutes to complete that survey. It is super helpful.
Thank you, Sarah. This is great information. I hope you guys have a chance to look at some of and be a part of next week's event. We expect that you will be there, at least for those of you who are 2018 cohort members. But I'm really looking forward to this, and I hope you are too. So I'm glad there are those of you bringing more folks on board. I know we're 4 minutes over time. I'll just say, Sarah, my child doesn't allow me to be on Twitter, but I will, I will certainly be encouraging others to be part of it. So all I have to say is have a great weekend, everybody. And thank you for your time and for all of your contributions and your work today, and enjoy the rest of a beautiful day. All right, take care. Thank you.